Chapter XVIII. A Fuel of Fire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fuel of Fire by Ellen Thorneycroft FOWLER. Chapter XVIII. Wedding Bells. You came, then undiscovered lands sprang straightway into view. You took my life within your hands, and all things were made new. So you too have taken to yourself idols, and made merry, and have forgotten the living God, said Rufus Webb to Michael Arbuthnot one day, when the vicar was calling upon his weird parishioner. No, Mr. Webb, I've done none of these things. I've merely believed God's statement, that every good gift and every perfect gift is from Him, and have accepted such gifts accordingly. And do you think that He will permit His chosen servant and minister to put the love of women before the love of God? He will not have to permit it, as far as I am concerned, replied Michael, with unruffled patience. And there is one thing He knows as well as, nay, better than, I do, and that is that my love for a woman has taught me more than I ever learned before of His love for me. It is only by loving one another that we learn anything of God's love for us. Beware lest you are crying peace where there is no peace, and are imagining vain things. I have imagined plenty of vain things in my time, goodness knows, but this one thing does not happen to be vain. Neither is it of my own imagining. I uphold that of all God's revelations of Himself to sinful man, there is none that teaches us so much about Him as our love for one another. How can our love for anything besides Himself be reckoned as other than idolatry? Asked Rufus. Because our love for each other is not separate from our love for Him, but is a part of it, just as the sparkle of a running brook does not detract from the glory of the sunshine, but rather adds to it, because they are really one and the same thing. Rufus merely shook his head, and the vicar continued, Besides, loving another person with a deep and sincere love gives us so much larger views of God's love for us. When we feel how tender is our own love, how we would rather die than cause the beloved one pain, and what we would sacrifice to ensure the loved one's happiness, all our petty doubts and questionings regarding God's dealings with us disappear. We know that we, faulty and imperfect as we are nevertheless incapable of leaving anything undone which would ensure the happiness of that one living creature. And is it conceivable that our love is a more perfect thing than God's love, that He created, being superior to Himself? Nay, we rather see that as we are each capable of caring for one other human being, and only one, so He is capable of caring for the whole human race. Otherwise we should be greater than He, and the clay cannot be greater than the potter who formed it. I fear you are comforting yourself with false doctrines. But the vicar stood firm. I think not. To my mind, the mediaeval ascetics and the Puritans, who in turn taught that human love was an evil thing, did more than any other heretics in placing false barriers between man and God, and in giving men incorrect ideas of Him. I cannot agree with you. I only wish I could. But how can you still go cherishing these delusive dreams when you see the ruin which overtook that young man, known to both of us, who had great possessions and loved them too well? And Rufus pointed out of his window to where the ruins of Baxendale Hall gleamed red among the trees. He loved houses and lands more than God. I loved my wife more than God, and it pleased God to take from each of us the desire of our eyes at a stroke. Then learn the wisdom from our afflictions, and take care that a like thing does not happen unto you. For cursed is he that putteth his trust in man, and taketh man for his defence, and his heart goeth from the Lord." "I think, Mr. Webb, you are unjust in saying that Baxendale loved his house and land inordinately. Personally, I never met a young man who, to my thinking, put so true a value upon worldly possessions. Like his father before him, he has one of the most refined natures I ever met with. The word gentleman, even in its most restricted and subtle sense, would always be descriptive of Lawrence Baxendale, and that most perfect and exhaustive portrait of a gentleman, the 15th Psalm, is entirely applicable to him. Yet the wrath of God came upon him and burned down his house before his eyes. I admit that his house was burned down, Mr. Webb, but, speaking with all reverence, I do not see that the wrath of God had anything to do with it. I have no patience with people who put down to God's account the evils which most distinctly are wrought by man." "Then do you deny that the burning of Baxendale was a judgment upon Lawrence Baxendale, or rather a discipline necessary to the saving of his soul?" Rufus Webb's excitement, never much under control, was rapidly getting the better of him. He began to walk up and down the small room, thrusting his hands the while through his masses of unkempt hair. "I do not believe it is anything of the kind," said the vicar firmly, "though I hold that all afflictions, by whatever agency they may be wrought, will do good to our souls if taken in a proper spirit. But I say that if any human being, whatever the motive may have been, set fire to Baxendale Hall on purpose, that human being was guilty of actual sin, and ought to make confession of the same. No, 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 not if Lawrence Baxendale's soul is saved thereby. It costs more than the burning of Baxendale Hall to redeem his soul. We must let that alone for ever. And we have no right to do evil that good may come." "But it is not doing evil to burn the accursed thing. It is not doing evil to destroy false gods and to cut down their groves. It is doing evil to devote ourselves so exclusively to our brother's mote, that we have no time for the extirpation of our own beams," said the vicar, rising to depart. For he knew that argument was worse than useless when Rufus was, as now, in one of his fanatical moods. "Good morning, Mr. Webb. Come up and have a chat with me at the vicarage whenever you feel inclined." And with that they parted. Nora, meanwhile, was holding a very different sort of conversation upon her prospects with Mrs. Candy, whom she had elected to go and see while Michael was calling upon Rufus Webb. "Good morning, Mrs. Candy," she began. "I hope you are very well." "Thank you, Miss Nora. I am as well as could be expected, seein' as I had to get up extra early this morning." "Why was that?" "Because Candy's got a busy mornin' before him, killin' the sheep." "Oh, can he kill a sheep? How clever of him!" "Yes, miss, he can kill a sheep all right, Candy can. There isn't much that Candy can't do, but he doesn't get the pleasure out of it he does out of killin' a pig, and it's no use pretendin' he do." "Of course there are degrees of pleasure in everything. No two treats are quite the same," said Nora, taking a seat upon a chair which her hostess had just dusted with her apron for that purpose. "And so you be a goin' to be married afore, Miss Nancy?" said Mrs. Candy, as soon as her visitor was seated. "Well, to be sure, it do seem the wrong way about for the youngest to be married first. I niver could abide it. I was always so glad as my sister Carry was safely married when Candy came a courtin' me, as I wouldn't ha' married before her, her being 16 months older than me for anythin'. And yet it would ha' gone agin the grain wi' me to give Candy the pass by." "Well, I am very sorry, but I don't see how I can help it," said Nora, penitently. "And as you say, it is a mistake to give really nice men, such as Mr. Arbuthnot and Mr. Candy, for instance, the pass-by. It is, miss, and I ween't deceive you, and her that will not when she may, 10 to 1 dies an old maid, or else has to put up wi' a widower wi' a family. I'm sure I don't know what I should ha' done if I'd let Candy slip through my fingers. It would ha' been the death of me, I doubt. Even now I sometimes dreams as Candy is married to Polly Postern, and I'm still in service at Overstrand, and it gives me such a turn, you can't think." "I'm sure it must. Yes, miss, it be a fine thing for a woman to have a man of her own to make up her mind for her, and keep her clear of fallers and the like. I don't hold wi' women keeping single, I don't. They get all sorts of notions in their heads, wi' no man to sweep away all the nonsense out o' them. There was my Aunt Mehetabel as niver was married, and she took it into her head to be an invalid, if you please, always enjoying some fresh complaint as no sensible folks had ever heard so much as the name of, and drinking medicine by the gallon. Why, no husband would ha' stood such rubbish, and quite right too." "That is true, Mrs. Candy. Men do keep us out of all sorts of silliness." "Then there was my Aunt Hephzibah. She niver married neither, but with her it didn't run to health rubbish. It took her in a religious way, and she joined the chapel folk." "Well, there wasn't much harm in that," said Nora, with a laugh. "Satan might have found some worse mischief for her idle hands, or rather her idle heart, to do." But Mrs. Candy looked serious, and shook her head. "He don't hold wi' chapel folk, don't Candy. He says as if Providence had meant folks to go to chapel instead o' to church, there'd have been a chapel instead of a church in every parish. And then chapel folk are always asking for money, and what's the use of paying for a chapel, he says, when you can get to church for nothing. Oh, but he's a wonnerful clear way o' putting things, has Candy." "You certainly seem to find him very convincing," said Nora, dryly. "Oh, he's a wonnerful clear head, Candy has. I often wish they'd got him up in Lunnon, in the House of Parliament, when I read a bit of the papers, and see what to and again work they make of it up there. He'd soon teach 'em what for, would Candy. What side would he be on, Liberal or Conservative?" "Oh, he wouldna take sides. He don't hold wi' taking sides, Candy don't. He just put his foot down on all that to and again work, and he'd have his own way or nothing at all. Eh, but he's a grand one for having his own way, is Candy. There's nothing double-faced or reasonable about him. He don't hold with it." "Then I don't expect he'd have consented to wait until your sister had been married first," suggested Nora. "Not he, miss, not he," replied his better half, with pride. "When Candy's once set his mind upon a thing, you might as well try to turn the way o' the wind as him. He ain't the shilly-shallying sort as will listen to reason. Not he. So I was thankful as Carry was safely wedded afore Candy came a courting me." "And whom did Carry marry?" "She married a man from our parts, o' the name of Parker. If when you marry you live all among your own people, it don't seem quite so bad," said she. "So she took up with Parker." "She doesn't appear to have been as much in love as you were, Mrs. Candy, for you came far enough from home when you married." "She wasn't, miss, and I'm the last to deceive you. But who could ha' thought she would be, seeing as it was only Parker as she was a marrying. Parker was a decent man, and a regular church goer, with 22 shillings a week, but he wasn't Candy, and it's no use pretending as he was." "Then you didn't mind coming such a long way from home?" Like all women who are truly in love, Nora was interested in the loves of all other women. "Not wi' Candy, miss. I'd ha' gone to the very ends o' the earth wi' him, and yet till I see him I'd niver been 10 miles away from Overstrand, and I darenna ha' gone as far as Yarmouth, no, not if you'd ha' crowned me. But Candy made all the difference. I understand that." "I'll be bound you do, Miss Nora, haven't been took that way yourself. Hey, but it's wonderful how a man do make all the difference. After onst he's come across your way, nothin' niver looks the same again, nor ever will. He seems to get into everythin', as you may say, and to turn it all topsy turvy." Nora laughed. "You are not very complimentary to the man to say he turns things topsy turvy." "Bless you, miss, you don't think as it's topsy turvy. It seems to you as if it was all topsy turvy afore, and that he's just turned in the right way up." "Like a dream seems topsy turvy, and the awakening turns things the right way up," Nora suggested. "That's just it, miss. And you laugh at the dream, when you remember how contrary it all was, and how right everything is now that you are wide awake." "Yes, Mrs. Candy, falling in love is just like that. The past is the dream, and this is the awakening. And it seems to me, miss, as dyin' will be like that, too. It'll turn things topsy turvy, I don't deny, but it'll be the right way up as it'll turn 'em, and we shall laugh when we remember the topsy turviness of this world, and wonner how we put up wi' it as contented as we did. I'm sure I wonner now how I could bear myself afore I met Candy. It seems as if there could ha' been nothin' to do and nothin' to think about. And I don't doubt as we shall feel like that when we wake up in heaven, miss, and see what bootiful things Providence has provided for us up there." "But don't you often think it is strange that we haven't been told more about the next world, and what it will be like?" said Nora. "Oh, don't you go worryin' yourself about that," replied Mrs. Candy, soothingly. "It isn't done out o' disagreeableness, as you may say, I feel sure. We aren't told more about it, because we couldn't understand it if we were. Why, miss, it's the same in this world. If I'd been told, when I was a little gell, what happiness was is store for me in workin' hard, hand and foot, to make Candy comfortable, and bein' ready to lay down my very life at his feet, if he wanted it, bless him, I shouldn't ha' knowed what they was a talkin' about. I thought that what I should want when I was growed up would be to have my own way and enjoy myself, instead of which my happiness is in lettin' Candy have his own way and enjoy hisself. But it would all ha' been Greek and Latin to me, if they'd ha' told me that when I was a little gell, and too young and soft to understand it. And I hold that it's like that wi' the next world, I do. We're too young and soft to understand it yet, even if we was to be told, so where would be the sense o' tellin' us?" "Well, Mrs. Candy, I believe you are right, and now I must be going," said Nora, rising from her seat. "Good morning." "Good morning to you, miss, and may you be as happy in your marriage as I've been in mine, and I can't say nothin' stronger than that. The gentry theirselves couldn't ha' been happier than Candy and I ha' been. I can't deny as sometimes I wish as the children had lived. It would ha' been pretty to hear 'em call Candy daddy, and to see 'em a climbin' over his knees. But the Lord knows best what is good for us, so we must just submit ourselves to His hand. Maybe if they'd ha' lived, they might ha' come between me and Candy, and I couldn't ha' stood that." "Thank you, Mrs. Candy, for all your good wishes, and if only I make as excellent a wife as you have done, I shall be quite content, and so will the vicar, or he ought to be." "Bless you, miss, who could ha' helped bein' a good wife to such a husband as Candy? 1 in 100, as I often tell him. And when all's said and done, them as has husbands are happier than them as has none. It's dull work bein' an old maid, Miss Nora. Say what you will, it's every woman's right to have a man of her own, and them as has missed that has missed the best in this world. Why, if you've got a man o' your own, there's always somebody to be sorry when you are sick, and pleased when you are about and busy, and there's always somebody to listen to what you say, and to show you what a fool you was for saying it. And there's always somebody to find fault wi' all your little fads, and yet to like you all the better for 'em. Mark my words, Miss Nora, there's no love in the world like the love of the man who loves you as his own flesh, and them as pretends that there is talks old maids' nonsense." "They do, Mrs. Candy. I haven't patience with people who try to make out that parents and brothers and sisters can ever make up to a woman for not having known what the love of a husband means." "Well, it don't, whativer them old maids choose to say. Why, Miss Nora, when my first baby come, and I'd got the baby and Candy, I felt as no leddy in the land could be happier than me, because, you see, there couldn't be anythin' better in the whole world than a husband like Candy, and a little baby as well. In fact, it was too much happiness for this sinful world. So the good Lord took the baby, and is savin' her up for me when I gets to heaven. Yes, miss, I sees it all now, as plain as plain. Candy and the childern was too much happiness for this life. So the Lord is savin' up the children for the next, just as we don't let our children have all their cakes and toys on one day, but we put some by till to morrow." And then Nora completed her farewells, and went out into the lanes, where she found her lover awaiting her. Early in October, Michael Arbuthnot took Nora Burton as his wedded wife, and great were the rejoicings in Tetley accordingly. The bridesmaids wore soft blue dresses, the colour of Nancy's eyes, and no one to see her could have guessed how heavy with crushed tears were those apparently laughing orbs. Nancy really played her part very well just then, and it was by no means an easy part to play. To a proud woman, the knowledge that her world regards her with pity is about as unpleasant a branch of instruction as she will ever have to master, and Nancy was fully cognizant of that particular fact just then. Though people in general did not know exactly what had happened, they were aware that Lawrence and Nancy had once walked and talked together, and now they walked and talked together no longer. And they drew their own conclusions accordingly, which conclusions, it must be admitted, were not altogether wide of the mark. As a rule, the public blamed Lawrence as a fool for not taking the insurance money and marrying upon it, for the fact that, owing to malicious reports, he had declined to accept the compensation to which his loss entitled him, had become public property by this time. Nancy was quite aware of this. There was not much that the young lady was not quite aware of, but it is not a source of any solid comfort to a woman to know that her world condemns as a fool the man to whom she has given her life's devotion. And yet, do what she would, she could not rid herself of her overmastering love for Lawrence Baxendale. She did not clutch her misery and make much of it, as a more sentimental girl would have done. On the contrary, she hated it so much that she would have escaped from it at any price. It was no pleasure to Nancy to be unhappy, as it is to so many women. Success was her role in life, and she sorely resented having to play a part so sadly out of character with her preconceived notions of herself. Nevertheless, go where she would and do what she could, she was all the while conscious of an underlying homesickness for Lawrence, which time did not cure, nor diversion allay. "I want him so, I want him so," she kept saying to herself, and nothing else in any way appeased that consuming need. Yet Nancy Burton was a girl whom other girls condemned as heartless and shallow, and whom the world in general envied rather than pitied, and laughed with rather than cried over. So penetrating and foreseeing, as a rule, is the judgment of a woman's world, and especially of her female friends. But she bore herself with a brave front, and no one noticed that she was gradually growing thinner and paler. Lawrence would have noticed it fast enough if he had seen her He had tried to crush his love, but he was not yet as blind as all that. But he went with Lady Alicia to stay at his uncle's soon after the burning of Baxendale, and did not return until the middle of the winter. He had been so sorely wounded by the gossip about himself and the cause of the fire, that for a time life in the neighbourhood of Baxendale was insupportable to his proud and sensitive spirit, and Mr. and Mrs. Burton were so full of their second daughter's affairs, and the new life upon which she was entering, that they did not give much attention to their elder for a while. So Nancy faded away day by day, and no one noticed, no one knew. One afternoon, not long after Nora's marriage, Mrs. Fairfax and her daughter were sitting in their entrance hall, as was their custom when the weather closed the verandah to them for a time. And an ideal hall it was, with its carved oak chimney corner, and its archways hung with costly curtains, and its walls lined with the portraits of dead and gone Fairfaxes. At no season of the year was Ways Hall without flowers. Flowers in the rooms, and in the hall, and on the staircase, and in every available space. Certainly in this case, when Mahomet could not go to the mountain came to Mahomet. When Mrs. Fairfax could not go to her garden came to her, so that it was always spring inside Ways Hall, whatever ridiculous tricks the weather might be playing outside. Mrs. Fairfax had grasped the truth which so few gardeners seem able to master, that a greenhouse is a means and not an end. In the autumn and winter the flowers were born and bred in her numerous hothouses, but that was merely for educational purposes. As soon as they reached perfection they were brought at once into the hall, and there made happier by their beauty and freshness the lives of Mrs. Fairfax and Faith. And by always living with flowers, these two women imbibed some of the nature of the flowers by which they were constantly surrounded. The brightness and freshness of the plants entered into the human being, and made them thereby better and truer women for time and for eternity. "My dear," Mrs. Fairfax remarked, after a few minutes' silence, apropos of nothing but her own meditations, "Lawrence Baxendale is a fool." "Oh, mother, what a thing to say!" "It's the truth, and the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Lawrence and his father were always fools. Nice, well-mannered, lovable fools, I will admit, but still fools of the finest water, the sort of fools whose folly is always getting between their own feet and tripping them up." Faith sighed. "Yes, I think poor Lawrence's mistakes always tell against himself more than against any one." "So did his father's. Some people's omissions are always on the debtor side of the account, and never on the creditor side. They forget what they owe to other people, but never what other people owe to them. But the Baxendales are the very opposite of that. Their blunders invariably tell against themselves, and their undertakings always seem to turn out badly somehow. Yes, the gift of success was withheld when the fairies presided at the Baxendale christenings. As a rule, there are two means by which a man may attain success: his own competence, or the incompetence of his fellows. But neither of these means has been of any use to the Baxendale men, and yet they are splendid men in their way." Mrs. Fairfax shrugged her still shapely shoulders. "Huh! I suppose they are cast in a somewhat heroic mould, but they are the sort of men who always put their money on the wrong horse, and identify themselves with the losing cause. In the time of the Reformation the Baxendales were Romanists. In the time of the Commonwealth they were Royalists. In the days of the Georges they were Jacobites, and I feel sure that in mediaeval times they were often nearly converted to Hebraism by the frequent persecutions of the Jews. But all that merely goes to prove their glorious courage and loyalty. Faith, like all very amiable people, had a strong strain of obstinacy in her composition. I think it often goes to prove their stupidity. Baxendale Hall, like Oxford, has always been the home of lost causes and impossible beliefs, and personally I'd rather live in the homes of governing majorities and established churches. It is more comfortable and less draughty. But men must have their ideals, mother, and servants must have their beer. But there is such a thing as beer money, my dear child, which does instead, and is often both more convenient and more profitable to all parties concerned." "And then the Baxendales are all so truthful and honourable," persisted Faith. "Far too much so. They tell you truths that you'd rather not hear. Personally, I hate people who always tell you the truth. Who wants to hear the truth? I'm sure I don't. It is always so humbling, and humility is the most depressing virtue out, though all virtues are more or less lowering unless taken in very small quantities." Faith smiled. "Dear mother, what things you say!" "Well, I mean them. At least I do now and then. But the Baxendale trick of truth telling really does depress me, and makes the perpetrators of it so unpopular, too. If you want people to be in love with you, you must begin by making them in love with themselves, and then the desired result will soon follow. But few people have learned this elementary truth, least of all the Baxendales." "Well, still there are people who love even the Baxendales." "My dear, there are people who eat coal and slate pencil and enjoy them. I never legislate for exceptions, but I own I sometimes wonder if little Nancy Burton is one of the exceptions who love Lawrence Baxendale." Faith shook her head. "She may, and does, I think, like him, but it isn't in her to love anybody. Nancy is a dear girl, full of life and high spirits, and is a most delightful companion. I always feel that a sight of her is like a breath of mountain air on a stuffy day, but hers is not a nature capable of deep affection." Yet Faith had got over her love for Lawrence Baxendale, and Nancy was slowly dying of it. So do the saints of the earth sit in judgment upon their more human sisters. "Well, I hope you are right, for any woman who loves Lawrence will find life a perpetual Lent, both as regards doctrines and dinners. Trust a Baxendale for finding out an altar on which to sacrifice himself and everybody belonging to him. All the Baxendales have keen noses for a sacrifice, and then, as I said before, I can't stand their way of putting one out of love with oneself." And the ex-beauty tossed her head in disgust. Faith was amused. "Poor Lawrence seems to have annoyed you." "Certain plain speaking I am accustomed to and can stand. For instance, no man ever went to another man's house without saying that the shrubs wanted thinning, and that there was too much window room. Everybody is prepared for plain speaking of that kind, and nobody resents it. But what I can't stand is when people show up all your little ignorances. What does it matter whether a woman is ignorant or not, as long as she has been good looking and is still well dressed? Yet Lawrence once quite corrected me for not knowing the difference between Addison and Pope, as if there really was any difference that mattered." "It is a pity that Lawrence has so taken to heart the absurd gossip about his burning down his own house, for it was very absurd," said Faith thoughtfully. "I should think it was, and showed an utter absence of knowledge of the merits of the case. As if any Baxendale would ever do anything either wrong or right, that in any way redounded to his own advantage. It isn't in the blood. I wouldn't breathe a word to any one but you, mother, but I always suspect poor old Rufus Webb of having set fire to the Hall in a fit of religious frenzy, though how he managed to do it from the upper story I can never conceive. He would imagine that by doing so he was saving Lawrence's soul." "I know you think so, my dear, but I don't think anything of the kind. I have my own ideas as to how Baxendale Hall was fired." Faith looked surprised. "Whoever do you suspect, mother dear? For goodness' sake don't go repeating what I say, and sending your mother to prison for libel. But my impression is that no one did it on purpose." "Then do you agree with Mrs. Candy that Lawrence himself did it by accident?" "No, my dear, but I think that those tiresome little Burton boys did." Mrs. Fairfax could never quite forgive any other woman for having borne sons while she herself had only had a daughter. "Oh, mother, how could Arthur and Ambrose have set fire to Baxendale Hall? Mischievous boys will find a way of doing anything that is troublesome and naughty. I don't know how they did it, but they did do it, I have no doubt, with their nasty bonfires and sacrifices and things. I found them offering up a sacrifice one day in the lanes, and it at once struck me how Baxendale had been burned. But it is proved that the fire began from the inside, and the boys couldn't get into a locked-up house," said Faith. "They could do so as well as that Webb man could, and you suspect him." "It is only an instinctive sort of a suspicion. I cannot for the life of me see how he could do it, much less how those little boys could." "They might have climbed through a window," suggested Mrs. Fairfax. "But the windows were all shut and the shutters fastened. Then perhaps they stole the keys and let themselves in. My dear, I don't pretend to say how they did it, but that those boys did do it, I repeat, I haven't the shadow of a doubt." Chapter 19. A Fuel of Fire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fuel of Fire by Ellen Thorneycroft Fowler. Chapter 19. Winter Days. The dying year is covered o'er with leaves, and weeping Nature for her children grieves. The vicar and their bride went to Italy for their honeymoon, and did not come back until the beginning of December. On their return, they found that winter had begun earlier than usual, and also with unwonted severity even for England, and that it was finding out all the delicate people, and numbering them with an accuracy which would have put the strictest census paper to shame. By this time Mr. and Mrs. Burton had discovered that all was not well with their elder daughter, in spite of the apparently high spirits she so persistently maintained. The same depressing conviction had also been borne in upon Anthony, and the trio were deeply concerned thereat. Not only was Nancy thinner and paler than she was at the time of Nora's wedding, but the cold weather had endowed her with a hacking little cough which went through the hearts of those that loved her. Nora and her husband were shocked to see the change that 2 short, to them extraordinarily short, months had wrought in the once radiant Nancy, and Mrs. Arbuthnot seconded her parents' fears that there was something very wrong indeed with her sister. Nancy carried her head as high as ever, and was as independent as of old of sympathy or pity, but the vulpine gnawing must tell in the long run, however great be the fortitude of the Spartan boy or his equivalent, and it was getting near to the end of the run, as far as Nancy's particular fox was concerned. She had staked her all on one cast of the dice, and had lost. Bereft of the one love of her life, she was indeed bereft. She simply could not live without Lawrence Baxendale. That was the long and the short of it. Some women are made after this pattern. They not only put all their eggs into one basket, a most unscientific mode of packing, they also find it impossible to sustain life without an adequate supply of eggs, eggs being absolutely indispensable to their existence. Hence, when the one basket breaks down, as those single baskets are so prone to do, there is nothing left to keep the starving creatures alive. Heaven help such poor fond souls, for earth is apt to be too hard for them. It is but fair to add that Lawrence himself had no idea how hardly things were going with Nancy. If he had guessed that she was slowly dying for want of him, nothing could have kept him away from her, for underneath his somewhat strained scrupulousness the man was a true man, and his love for Nancy was of the finest quality. But he was so little of a coxcomb that the notion that a woman could die for love of him never once entered into his head, and he would have scorned it as an absurdity had any one suggested it to him. There was another reason why he dared not yet return to Poplar Farm, and that was his undying love for the said Nancy, and his fear that if he were brought face to face with her again, all his scruples would avail him nothing, and he should once more take her into his heart, and swear that he would never let her go. And this he had definitely decided not to do, for let other people say what they would, Lawrence was fully persuaded in his own mind that Baxendale Hall had been set on fire by one of two persons, either by his mother or by Nancy. These were the only two, except himself, who had any motive for doing this thing. These were the only two, as far as he knew, who had access to the keys of the front door and the library, and the house had evidently been fired from the inside and from the upper story. And these were the only two who had ever suggested that he himself might commit the crime. And this conclusion formed in his eyes an insurmountable barrier between himself and Nancy. If Lady Alicia were guilty, then his mother's shame was his, and he had no right to ask any other woman to share his dishonour. If, on the contrary, Nancy were guilty, then he was ready to lay down his life to shield her good name, but he was not altogether prepared to exchange it for his own. Baxendale had not as yet gauged the overwhelming force of human love in general, and of his own in particular, but he had gauged it sufficiently not to want to be brought into contact with Miss Burton just then, so he kept out of temptation's way. There is no doubt that he was sorely to be pitied. To feel certain that either one's mother or the woman whom one loves has been guilty of a dishonourable act, of a crime, in fact, in the eyes of the law, is not a conviction belonging to the peace of any man's soul, even of the most callous and unscrupulous. And Lawrence Baxendale was neither unscrupulous nor callous, so that the bitterness of this conviction was to him as the very bitterness of death. When the vicar and his wife were sitting at breakfast one morning, not long after their return to Tetley, the maid brought in the card of Dr. Arrowsmith, one of the Silverhampton doctors. "What on earth can he want?" said Michael, looking at the card. "Let's have him in and ask him," Nora suggested. "It will be the simplest way of finding out, just as opening one's letters is so much simpler than trying to guess from the postmark who they come from. Yet nearly everybody tries the latter method first." "Shall we have him in here?" asked the vicar, doubtfully. "Of course. I want to hear what he has got to say." "But, dearest, the breakfast is all about." "That doesn't matter. He must know that even clergymen eat sometimes, especially as he is a doctor." "Still, darling, he may not wish you to hear what he has got to say." "Oh, Michael, what a fussy old maid you are. I can't think what induced me to marry an old maid." "Possibly because the old maid happened to fall in love with you," suggested the vicar. "That must have been it. Nobody but old maids ever did fall in love with us, worse luck. Lawrence Baxendale is an older maid than you are. A younger man, I know, but an older maid. He fell in love with Nancy, and I can't keep count of how many others have done it besides. It seems an old maidish trick that they fall into." "But what about Dr. Arrowsmith, Nora?" said the vicar, again looking at the card. "I've told you. Go and bring him in here. If you don't, I shall have to fetch him myself." Michael did as he was bid, kissing his wife as he passed by her chair on his way to the door, though how his wife's chair came between him and the door, considering that his chair was just in front of that egress and his wife's at the other end of the room, it is difficult to understand. Still, it was only on a par with his having maintained in former days that the nearest way from the church to the vicarage at its gates was by wayside, a mile and a quarter distant. Evidently Mr. Arbuthnot had not the bump of locality. Many men, especially young ones, are similarly lacking. He was by no means peculiar. As Nora had bidden him, her husband brought Dr. Arrowsmith at once into the dining room. "I'm so sorry to trouble the vicar thus early in the morning, Mrs. Arbuthnot," began the letter, shaking hands with Nora, "but I am aware that a man called Rufus Webb is a parishioner of his, and a remarkable man, too." "Yes," replied Nora, "he is quite a character. Everybody knows him about here." "I hope you do not bring bad news of him," added her husband. "I do, Mr. Arbuthnot. The very worst, I fear, that I could bring. Webb has been knocked down and run over by a heavy dray, and is now dying in Silverhampton Hospital, where he was taken immediately after the accident." Nora's pretty eyes filled with tears. "Oh, how sad, how dreadfully sad. When did it happen?" "Yesterday afternoon. At first we hoped that we should pull him through, but this morning it is quite evident that there is no hope of his recovery." "How came a dray to run over him?" asked the vicar. "The streets of Silverhampton are not generally so crowded, especially in an afternoon, that there need be any danger in crossing them." He says he was so dizzy that he did not see the dray coming till it was upon him. Dizzy? What made him dizzy? A big, strong man like that ought not to have been feeling dizzy," said Nora. "Was he ill, do you think?" "No, Mrs. Arbuthnot, he wasn't ill, but I am afraid he was hungry," and the doctor's voice was a little husky. "Hungry?" cried Michael. "Rufus Webb hungry? I knew that he was poor, but I hadn't an idea that things were as bad with him as that." "He was dying of hunger," said Dr. Arrowsmith. The vicar's lip trembled. "Good heavens! And I never knew. What a blind fool I have been!" "He has evidently been starving for some weeks," continued the doctor, "and that is why he has no strength to rally from the accident. A man in better condition would soon have recovered from such injuries as Mr. Webb has received, but he is so sadly weakened by want of proper nourishment, I might say by want of any nourishment, that there is not the slightest chance of his recovery." "Poor Mr. Webb! Poor Mr. Webb!" exclaimed Nora, who was fairly crying by this time. "He cannot live many hours, and as he particularly desires to see Mr. Arbuthnot, I came at once to fetch your husband. I gather that he has some sort of confession to make, as he keeps saying that he cannot die with an unconfessed sin upon his soul." The same thought flashed simultaneously through the minds of Michael and his wife, as the same thought so often flashes simultaneously through the minds of two people who perfectly love and understand each other, the thought that the mystery of the burning of Baxendale Hall was about to be solved, and that at last Lawrence would feel himself free from any shadow of suspicion, and be at liberty to take the money and marry Nancy. And the thought filled them with joy, for the sight of Nancy's pinched face, upon which time was already beginning to write lines which told a sad story of faith disappointed, and hope deferred, and love unsatisfied, was a sight which cut both the vicar and his wife to the heart. But aloud they only said how grieved they were for Rufus Webb's misfortune, and the vicar made himself ready with all speed to accompany Dr. Arrowsmith to the hospital. "It is as much as we shall do to get there before he dies," the doctor said. "God grant that I may be in time to hear his confession," murmured the vicar, and Nora, from her heart, echoed her husband's prayer. Chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Fuel of Fire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fuel of Fire by Ellen Thorneycroft FOWLER. Chapter 20. To what purpose? It surely would have been but common sense to sell this ointment for 300 pence, and give to those who cannot food afford. Say, to what purpose was this waste, O Lord? When the vicar of Tedley and Dr. Arrowsmith arrived at Silverhampton Hospital, Rufus Webb's sun had well nigh gone down. But he knew Michael, and evinced a wish to speak to him alone, so the doctor went away, leaving the two together. "I'm so thankful you have come," the sick man gasped. "I was afraid you would not arrive in time, and I cannot die in peace until I have extracted a promise from you to do something for me after I am gone." "I will do anything in my power for you, Webb," replied Michael. Rufus drew a key from a ribbon which was tied round his neck. "This is the key of a tin box which you will find in my cottage at the Ways. Promise me faithfully that you will burn the contents of that box, that you will destroy them utterly, and let them be consumed by the fire that may be quenched, lest the fire that never can be quenched shall consume my own soul also." "I promise." "Promise also that no one shall read the contents of that box save yourself, and maybe your wife, since those whom God hath joined together man may not put asunder." "I promise," repeated the vicar. "I meant to burn them myself, so that other men should not see my iniquity and glory in my shame, but the God of vengeance has ordered it differently, for he has ordained that what is done in secret shall be proclaimed on the housetops, and that which is hidden shall be made manifest. I promise faithfully that I will burn whatever I find in that tin box, and that no one shall ever look upon its contents save my wife and I." An expression of peace stole over Webb's white face. "I knew I could trust you," he murmured. "Yes, you knew you could trust me, a mere sinful man such as yourself, but you could not trust the God whose minister I am, And why should you believe that the God you worship is inferior to his own priests? I have served him and feared him with all my heart. That may be, but you have neither loved him nor trusted him, and by your unbelief you have crucified him afresh." The dying man lay silent for a few minutes with closed eyes. Then he opened them again and said, "I wonder if you are right, and if I have misjudged him all these years." "I am sure of it." "And do you think he will pardon me that also, in addition to my many other sins? For I am beginning to hope that there is mercy reserved even for me." "I am sure of it," repeated the vicar, "although it is hard, even for him, to be misjudged by those whom he loves. There are few things harder." There was another pause, and then Rufus roused himself again and rambled on. "I have a sin on my conscience which I fain would confess. I've made idols to myself with my own hands, and worshipped them. You will find them in the tin box. Have you nothing on your conscience also with regard to the burning of Baxendale Hall?" The vicar spoke very distinctly. He saw that the time was growing short, and he longed for Lawrence to be cleared by Rufus before Rufus died. "Yes, yes, that it is. I was so busy watching for Lettice to come and meet me, that I forgot what I was saying. She always meets me when I come home in the evening, you know. But to night she is late, and it is growing dark, too. Ah, there is her white dress among the poppies. And there are so many poppies this year, and they are so red, so red. Red like crimson, and white as wool." The vicar finished the sentence. "Though your sins be red like crimson, they shall be made white as wool. You know that, Webb." But Rufus was wandering. "Yes, the poppies are red. See how red they are. And Lettice's dress is quite white, white as her own sweet soul. And the flames of Baxendale Hall are red, too, like tongues of fire. Look how red." Michael made another effort to recall the sick man's senses. "Listen, Webb. Answer me one question. Had you anything to do with the burning of Baxendale?" The fading intelligence flickered up again. "Yes, I had. I saw that the young man's soul must be saved, though so far as by fire, and I prayed God day and night that he would send down fire from heaven to consume Baxendale Hall, and the Lord who answered by fire, he was God. But did you do more than pray? For God's sake, tell me this, Webb, for the happiness of many depends upon your answer." The vicar was desperate. It was so hard to get a sensible reply out of Webb in his present condition, and it seemed cruel to press for one. Yet if Webb died without making confession, how should he, Michael, ever face Nora and her sister again? Nancy's life depended upon the matter at issue, and Nancy's life must be saved if possible. "Speak, Webb," the vicar urged. "Did you do more than pray for the burning of Baxendale Hall?" "Yes, but I could not enter the library, you see, where all Lawrence Baxendale's idols were set up, as only he possessed the key." Webb was fully conscious now. "Yes, go on. Tell me all, quickly." "I prayed for an occasion, and yet none came." "And you never had the chance of doing what you wished?" "Yes, I understand. Get on. For heaven's sake, get on," said Michael, putting to the sick man's lips a cordial which the doctor had left with him in case it was needed. The cordial did its work well, and for a few moments the soul came back into Rufus Webb with a flash of its former fire. And then the great mighty wind came, and the Lord was not in the wind, and the earth shook and quaked withal, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And I stood before Baxendale Hall, and saw it as a reed shaken in the wind, and I prayed that the Lord would raise it even to the ground, so that the soul of Lawrence Baxendale might be saved." "Yes, yes, and what happened then?" "My prayer was not answered. The great and strong wind passed by, and Baxendale Hall stood firm. The next day there was a great calm, and I stood before the Lord, and prayed him again that Baxendale should be destroyed for Lawrence's sake. And as I prayed, I looked down to the ground, and beheld lying at my feet a bunch of keys. among others, the keys of the hall and the library. And I said, God has delivered the hall into my hand. I will go in and do with it even as I will. Michael's heart beat fast, and he prayed that Webb's life might be spared until he had made a full confession. "And so you went into the house?" he prompted. The dying man's eyes were bright with unnatural excitement. It was the last flicker before the light went out. "No. Just as I was going to open the front door, I heard a voice say in my ear, 'What doest thou here, Rufus?' And I answered, 'I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, because thy children have forsaken thy covenant, and torn down thy altars, and have followed after false gods. But now I will destroy their idols, and cause their images to cease out of the land.'" For a second Rufus struggled for breath, and Michael's heart stood still for fear that even now Webb would die before his full confession was made. But the unnatural exaltation still upheld him, and he went on again. "Then the voice said unto me, Son of man, turn thee yet again. Thinkest thou that the Lord seeth not, or that he hath forsaken the earth? To him belongeth vengeance and recompense, and it is he that killeth, and he that maketh alive. He alone can create, and he alone can destroy. Neither is there any that can deliver out of his hand." And when the voice had done speaking unto me, I turned me away from Baxendale Hall, for I knew that I was not counted worthy to save the soul of Lawrence Baxendale, nor to offer up his dwelling place as a sacrifice to the Lord of hosts. It is only clean hands that can offer up burnt offerings, and mine were red with blood, the blood of my own wife. Good heavens, Webb, do you mean to say that you did not set fire to that place after all? "Nay, the burning of Baxendale was not to mine honour, for the Lord delivered it into the hand of a woman. How could you tell it was a woman, and not a man, that burned down the hall?" The vicar was now almost as much excited as Rufus Webb himself, because the keys belonged to a woman who had left the house just before I prepared to enter it, and who had done there as she listed, with none to hinder her or to make her afraid. And blessed among women shall she be, blessed shall she be above women in the tent. For to her it was given to save the soul of Lawrence Baxendale, and to burn his images with fire, and to destroy the accursed things within his house. Rufus fell back on his pillow exhausted, and Dr. Arrowsmith came and stood behind Arbuthnot. "It is nearly over now," he whispered. Michael put his mouth close to the dying man's ear. "The name of the woman, for heaven's sake, tell me the name of the woman," he entreated. Webb's voice was so weak as to be scarcely audible. "The name of the woman, do you say? There is but one woman's name in the whole world, and that is Lettice. My Lettice, my wife. See, there she is coming to meet me through the field of poppies, the red poppies. Don't you see her, in her white dress, and the little curls on her neck, and the dimple in her cheek? I knew she would come. She never keeps me waiting. Look how the wind is blowing the little curls across." But Rufus never finished the sentence on earth. Lettice herself heard the end of it. "It is all over," said the doctor softly. Michael stood as a man stunned. One thought, and one only, still possessed his mind, and branded itself upon his very soul. "It must have been Lady Alicia," he kept saying over and over again to himself. "It must have been Lady Alicia." On her husband's return from Silverhampton, Nora was bitterly disappointed to learn that not only had Rufus Webb not confessed to having burned down Baxendale Hall, he had also confessed to not having done so. Therefore the mystery was as impenetrable as ever. The vicar did not tell her, or anybody else, Webb's story about the keys, and his conviction that it was a woman's hand that had actually done the deed. Michael now felt no doubt in his own mind that Lady Alicia was the culprit, since, so far as he knew, she was the only woman who had access to the keys of Baxendale Hall. But the discovery of her guilt would make matters worse instead of better for Lawrence. No honourable man would touch money obtained by his own mother's crime, and his misery would be increased tenfold if that mother were publicly convicted of arson. So the vicar decided to lock up Webb's confession in his own breast, and never reveal it to anybody. The following day he and his wife went together to Webb's cottage at the Ways. and found there the tin box, as Rufus had said. Save this one box, there was hardly any furniture left in the house. Webb had parted with almost everything he possessed in order to buy bread. "What do you think there is inside?" Nora whispered to her husband. "Probably some relic of his dead wife, but we will open it and see." So they unlocked it, wondering what pathetic little mysteries they should find therein. To their surprise, they found no love tokens, only heaps of manuscripts, all in Webb's own handwriting, and to their still greater amazement they discovered that these were the manuscripts of unpublished novels. At the top of the box was the following paper: "It is my intention to burn these manuscripts before I die, so that my secret may perish with me and my sin be covered. But if God in his justice sees fit to prevent this, I solemnly adjure whosoever opens this box utterly to destroy its contents, and to let not one escape. May God forgive me my sin in writing them, but they were so burned into my brain that I felt I must write them in spite of myself, even though I knew I was denying the living God in so doing. I believe my brain would have burst had I not given expression to the ideas which consumed it. Nevertheless, it would have been better for me to enter into life, having stamped out the intellect which separated me from my God, than with all my powers to be cast into hell, where their worm dieth not, and their fire is not quenched. I hold that novel writing and novel reading are heinous sins, for whosoever loveth and maketh a lie shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, and I would rather die for lack of bread than earn money by such a means as this. I will never endanger the souls of others by letting them read that which I, in my folly, have written, but maybe I speak as a fool, the mere writing of it may be forgiven me, if the memorial of it perishes with me, and it be destroyed for evermore. Signed, Rufus Webb. Before burning them, Michael and his wife read Webb's manuscripts, as he had given them permission to do, and they were astonished at the brilliance of the novels. Admirable in elegance of style, mastery of delineation of character, powerful in portrayal of feeling, they bore the rare hallmark of genius, and might have ranked, had they been published, among the greatest novels of the day. When they had finished reading the books, the vicar said that he must burn them at once. Nora besought him not to do so. "It seems a sin," she said, "to burn books which might give pleasure to hundreds and thousands of people, and do them a lot of good, too, besides winning fame for the author." But Michael was as adamant. "Can I break a promise made to a man who is dead?" he asked. "But, Michael, dear, it seems such an awful pity that all that genius should be utterly wasted. To what purpose is this waste? Is that what you would ask, my Nora?" "Yes, it is. Think what a great deal of money these manuscripts would fetch from any publisher, and what a tremendous lot of good might be done with the money. Wouldn't it be better to found a hospital or an orphanage or something in memory of Mr. Webb than to keep a senseless promise which he extorted from you when probably he was delirious?" "He wasn't delirious, Nora. He was perfectly conscious when he asked me to make the promise, and it is enjoined on the paper on the box." "But so much good might be done with the money," persisted Nora. "It might have been sold for 300 pence and have been given to the poor," quoted her husband. "Nevertheless, dear child, I must keep my promise." Webb knew what he meant when he asked me to make it. Doesn't it strike you what it meant to him when you realize that he literally died of starvation rather than earn what he considered were the wages of sin, though the source of considerable wealth lay in that box all the time, and he knew it? Nora began to cry. "Poor, poor Mr. Webb," she sobbed. "It is all too sad to think about. But he was a good man." "He was one of the saints of God," said Michael gently, "but he never found it out." "I expect he has found it out by now." "I'm sure he has." And then they burned the heap of manuscripts. When the last scrap of paper had been consumed, Nora said through her tears, "Oh, Michael, how terrible it is to think that all that poor man's genius and strength and capacity for feeling were utterly wasted." "Not wasted, Nora. There is no such thing as waste in God's economy." The following Sunday the vicar of Tetley preached a sermon on the success of failure, from the text, "To what purpose is this waste?" He showed that futile efforts, disappointed hopes, unrequited loves, unfulfilled ideals, unrealized ambitions, misplaced trusts, none of these are really wasted, that it was only when the money had been spent and the alabaster box broken and the spikenard had been spilled that the house was filled with the odour of the ointment. People said that it was the best sermon he had ever preached, but he said it was the best sermon that Rufus Webb had ever preached, and perchance he was right. All this time Lawrence Baxendale was keeping away from Poplar Farm, and Nancy was slowly dying for the want of him. Anthony saw what was wrong with his favourite cousin, and for a while held his peace upon the subject, but after a bit silence was unendurable to him, and he felt constrained to speak. "I say, Nan," he airily remarked one day, "you don't seem in especially good spirits." "Who could be in good spirits in such weather as this?" asked Nancy, looking at the rain which was drearily running down the window. "I admit it would be difficult, and then it would be only spirits and water. By the way, why don't our friend Baxendale come back home again? He has been away an unconscionable time." Nancy's pale face flushed. "How can he come back to live among people who have said such horrid things about him?" "My dear child, sensitiveness as to the remarks of our neighbours is a sure symptom that our livers want attending to. No healthy animal cares a rap what its neighbours do or do not say about it. Therefore I should strongly advise friend Baxendale to drown his woes in calomel, and return to rest in the house of his fathers, by which I mean the farm of his mother." Nancy did not reply, and there was silence for a moment. Then Anthony suddenly blurted out, "I say, Nancy, I wish you wouldn't fret after that brute. He isn't worth it, Nancy, he really isn't." "I suppose nobody is really worth fretting about," replied Nancy, ruefully, "when you come to that. But that doesn't prevent you from doing it if you are that way inclined. Still, I wish you wouldn't do it, Nancy, and especially about such a prig as Baxendale. I know I'm an idiot for doing it. Nobody knows that better than I do. But I can no more help fretting after Lawrence than I can help breathing. And it is so unlike me, too. I used to enjoy things so, and never to mind about anything. But after he came into my life, everything became different, and now I can no more put him out of my life again than I can change my skin and my spots, a la the leopard and the Ethiopian." "Confound the fellow!" said Anthony under his breath. "It is no use blaming him, Tony. He can no more help it than I can. You are the last girl that I should have expected to sacrifice her life to a brute of a man, after the fashion of a suttee and rot of that kind." Nancy laughed a sad little laugh, out of which all the merriment had faded. "I couldn't have sacrificed myself on a common altar, not on an altar that hadn't been passed by an inspector and licensed by the local authorities, you know. But Lawrence happened to be all that. He is the best and the most honourable and the highest minded man I ever met. Therefore I couldn't help loving him, nor could I ever leave it off when once I had begun. I say, Nan, I wish you'd marry me and forget all that Baxendale stuff." Nancy looked up in amazement. "Marry you, Tony? What an idea! Why, I thought you were cut out to be an old bachelor." The ancients remarked, "Call no man single till he is dead," or words to that effect, and they were intelligent people. "But, Tony—" "Oh, you needn't say you don't love me. I know that well enough, bless you. But I don't mind admitting you to my confidence to the extent of confiding in you that I do love you, little as your own conscience will tell you that you deserve such an honour. And I think I could cure you of that old Baxendale rot, if you'd let me try. Do let me try, Nancy, there's a darling." Nancy shook her head. "No, Tony. I once gave myself, heart and soul, to Lawrence Baxendale, and whether he values the gift or not, I cannot take it back again. I'm his for time and for eternity, even if he doesn't know it." "Confound him!" repeated Anthony. "And there is another reason why I couldn't marry you, Tony, even if I would. Can't you see that I'm dying, and shall never marry anybody now?" "Rubbish!" said Tony, roughly. "It isn't rubbish, dear. I am dying, simply because I can't live without Lawrence, just as other people die because they can't live without food, or air, or water. And even in dying, I only care about him. I know it's wicked of me, but the whole point of going to heaven at all seems to be that Lawrence will be there, and that I shall walk in unending lanes with him through all eternity. That is all I care for. If the angels say to me when I get there, as people say in banks, 'How will you take it, Miss Burton?' I shall say, 'One Lawrence Baxendale, and the rest in lanes.' That's my idea of heaven." And Nancy went out of the room, shutting the door behind her. "Confound the brute!" said Anthony under his breath once more, only this time he did not use the word confound. CHAPTER XXI. Chapter 21. A Fuel of Fire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fuel of Fire by Ellen Thorneycroft Fowler. Chapter 21. Lady Alicia. If a sin performed is worthy blame, is sin intended just the same? After the new year came in, the weather was so severe and Nancy so fragile that Mr. and Mrs. Burton decided to take her to Mentone for a time, in order to see what a warmer climate would do for their darling, and simultaneously Lord and Lady Portcullis, with Lady Alicia Baxendale as their guest, likewise found refuge from the ferocity of an English spring in the south of France. On his relation's departure from Drawbridge Castle, Baxendale returned to Poplar Farm, which return occurred just a week before the Burtons fled on the wings of the winter wind to where they hoped the winter wind could not reach them. Poor Nancy never walked in the lanes now, for to her they were as one huge green cemetery of buried hopes and joys, and not being the kind of woman who haunts burying grounds, she wisely avoided them. There are some natures that cling to the last resting places of what they have loved, and delight to plant flowers there, watering these flowers with tears, and there are others who cannot bear the agony which the mere sight of such sepulchres arouses, and who would therefore fain hide their dead away out of their sight, and let them be as though they had never been. God pity those bereaved hearts whose sole happiness lies in remembrance, for their sorrow is indeed great. But God help those more sorely afflicted ones whose sole happiness lies in forgetfulness, for their misery is infinitely greater. Therefore it never came to pass that Lawrence met Nancy walking in the lanes, as they used so often to meet in the happy far-off days. But on the Sunday he saw her face to face coming out of Tetley Church, and the sight cut him to the heart. Was that thin, pale, careworn woman his sunny little Nancy? And was his the hand that had wiped the sunshine out of that bleached face, and written sorrow in capital letters all over it? As his heart went out silently in an agony of pity toward the girl whose life he had deliberately spoiled, a wild hope took hold of Lawrence that Nancy was innocent after all, and his mother the real culprit. He hated himself for wishing to prove his mother guilty. He felt that such a wish was despicable in the extreme, but he had never loved her as he had loved Nancy, and therefore her possible wrongdoing did not wound him to the quick as Nancy's did. He loved Lady Alicia so little that forgiveness toward her came easy to him. He loved Nancy so much that he felt a sin of hers would be branded into his very soul, and that nothing could wipe it out for ever. That his mother should be weighed in the balances and be found wanting was an endurable and by no means unexpected accident. But that Nancy should fall short of the ideal which he had formed of her was a calamity sufficient to make angels weep, a punishment which he felt was greater than he could bear. If, however, Lady Alicia had set fire to the Hall, then Nancy was as innocent as he himself, and there was no reason why he should not fall on his knees before her and beg her pardon for even having distrusted her, and let her comfort his sore heart as she alone knew how to comfort it. If Nancy was heartsick for Lawrence, he was none the less heartsick for Nancy. The agony of separation was not killing him as it was killing her, because a man's physique is made of stronger elements than a woman's. But he hungered and thirsted and prayed and agonized not one whit less than she. She was the one human being to whom he had shown all that was in his heart, before whom he had poured out the hidden treasures of his soul. And having once broken down the hedge of his reserve, the longing to do it again was almost uncontrollable. Yet there was no one with whom he could do it save Nancy. He still felt that his mother's crime would always be his disgrace, but he knew Nancy well enough to understand that she would be willing to share even dishonour with him, and, what was more, he did not mind her sharing it. At last his love had shown itself stronger than his pride, and he realized that Nancy's pity would heal his sores rather than wound him afresh. But even yet his love was not strong enough to bear that his queen should do wrong and still remain his queen. It could stand anything but that Nancy herself should fall below his ideal of her. For this he felt he could never forgive her, because in that case her sin would be against herself rather than against him. He could forgive mere sins against himself, but for sins against the woman whom he worshipped there was no pardon to be found. While Lawrence's heart was daily softening toward Nancy, and his soul was hourly crying out for her, the Burtons and their daughter started for Mentone, and he looked in vain in all the familiar places for the pale little face which had become the centre of his universe. Nancy was now out of his reach. But that did not put her out of his thoughts. In fact, it had a precisely opposite effect. All that early spring, when the roads were swept clean by the east wind, and the fields smelt of the daisies that were yet to be, for there is always a smell of future daisies in the air on the first spring days, Lawrence's heart went out to Nancy, and cried for her as thirsty men cry for water in a barren and dry land where no water is. The more he thought about it, the more fully he became convinced that it was his mother who had set fire to Baxendale Hall, his poor, foolish mother, who had never been able in all her life to discover the distinction between good and evil, much less to choose the one and refuse the other. He remembered how she had begged him to do the deed himself, and how utterly futile had been his efforts to convince her that such a suggestion was of the nature of sin, and he knew her well enough to understand how she could succeed in convincing herself that she was actually performing a righteous act in fulfilling the old prophecy, as well as in making her son, as she thought, a rich man for the rest of his life. The memory of Nancy's suggestion that he should burn down the house of his fathers, a suggestion which had been eating into his very soul for the last 6 months, and making his existence a burden to him, began gradually to fade from his memory. After all, he had laid too much stress on the girl's idle words, he told himself. Was she not always talking nonsense which she did not in the least mean, and making absurd statements which he never expected to be believed? And had he not shown himself an arrant fool in taking this one conversation of hers au pied de la lettre, instead of accepting it as the mere joke for which it was intended? So during that spring Nancy once more regained her place in Lawrence's life, and he eagerly looked forward to the time when he could take her into his arms again, and pour out all his story of shame and sorrow and wounded sensibility into her sympathetic ear. He would make her understand him this time, he said to himself. He would never again be guilty of the folly of setting up a barrier of reserve between himself and the woman whom he adored. He would tell her the whole truth, how he believed that Lady Alicia was the culprit who had set Baxendale Hall in flames, and that therefore he could not take the insurance money. And he felt sure when Nancy heard this she would see the utter impossibility of his allowing himself to reap any pecuniary benefit from his mother's crime. He could not write all this to Nancy. His suspicion against Lady Alicia must never be set down in black and white, lest the very birds of the air should carry it abroad. It must only be whispered into Nancy's ear, and locked up in her loving breast for the rest of their lives. So he decided to wait until she came back to Wayside, and to put everything straight between herself and him when they met. The warmer climate of the sunny south did not do as much for Nancy as her parents had hoped. She lost her cough, and the doctors could find nothing organically wrong with her, but neither climate nor medicine can do much in the way of ministering to a mind diseased. Had the last miserable 6 months been blotted out, Nancy would speedily have become as strong and well as she had ever been in her life, but she could not forget things. She was not made after that pattern, and the memory of what in one short year she had won and lost was killing her as surely as, if more slowly than, any disease defined by the faculty. And yet she prayed to forget. She hated to remember. That was the hard part of it. There are sweet-natured women who can cherish their sorrow until it becomes to them a familiar friend on earth and a guide to heaven, who order their harmonious goings by the thought of what their loved ones would have wished, until upon these gentle souls those loved ones exercise a stronger influence than they ever exercised in the days of their flesh. And such women are tried by sorrow as by a refiner's fire, and come out as burnished gold. But Nancy was not after this kind. She was passionate rather than tender, and so the grace of a day that is dead had no hold upon her. On the contrary, she chafed against it and hated it, and longed to blot it forever out of the book of her remembrance. She wanted no tender memories of Lawrence to occupy the place he had left vacant in her heart. She desired not that grief should fill the room up of her absent love, and remember her of all his gracious parts. Gentler women would have wished this, but not Nancy. She wanted the man himself, just as he was, with all his over-scrupulousness and impracticability and unreasonableness, to have and to hold for better, for worse, till death should them part. Failing this, she prayed for forgetfulness, prayed that he might depart out of her existence altogether, and the memory of him might not trouble her again, that he would leave her free to live her own life, unvexed by the haunting shadows of what might have been. And yet she was so fashioned that oblivion was impossible to her. The boon she craved was strictly denied to her by the peculiarities of her own nature. The more she strove to hate and to forget, the more passionately did she love, and the more vividly did she remember, for the which surely Heaven pitied her. Spring had fully dawned when Lady Alicia came back to England and to Poplar Farm. Her son was delighted to see the change which the journey had wrought in her. She looked younger and happier, and consequently handsomer, than she had looked for years. "I'm so glad to see you so well, mother," said Lawrence affectionately. "Yes, dear Lawrence, I know I look well. I noticed it myself in the looking-glass, which so often tells us anything but a flattering tale, as dear somebody, I forget his name, remarked. It was the warm weather suited you." "Ah, it was not only the climate, dear Lawrence, that renewed my youth, though I confess sunshine is very sweet and soothing, even if somewhat trying to the complexion. But it does no real damage if one always wears a gauze veil. Your dear aunt's maid would not permit me, positively would not permit me to step out of doors without a white gauze veil, and I felt most grateful to her for her forethought. She is an excellent person, quite excellent. I don't know what I should have done without her." Lawrence sighed. "I wish I could afford for you to have a maid of your own, mother." "Well, dear child, I cannot deny that a maid has a very beneficial effect upon a woman's character. You see, it is quite impossible to find leisure for cultivating one's higher nature if one has to do one's own hair, and look after one's own wardrobe, and yet it is so sweet to cultivate one's higher nature if one can find time, almost a duty, in fact." "I suppose it is." Lawrence with difficulty repressed a smile. "I always think dear St. Peter, or was it St. Paul's remark, I invariably mix the two up, about a woman not plaiting her hair or putting on golden apparel, but having a meek and quiet spirit instead, is so very beautiful and appropriate. But it is only those women who have a maid to see to the plaiting of the hair and the putting on of the apparel that get the time to attend to the development of the meek and quiet spirit. One woman really cannot undertake both departments herself, and yet it is so sad for either to be neglected." "I suppose if you had only time for one, you would consider the former more important," said Lawrence. "Of course, dear child, of course, because one loses caste if one's hair is badly done, or one's clothes are shabby, while nobody thinks any the worse of one for not having a meek and quiet spirit. Not that I don't think it is very sweet and Christian to be both. I do indeed. But of course the things that show are always of more importance than the things that don't show. Anybody can see that." "Of course." Lawrence's tone was dry. "And now I have a confession to make to you, dear Lawrence, a most serious confession. I'm afraid you will be very angry with me. You have a somewhat unreasonable temper, as your poor dear father had, but I feel sure you will pardon me in the end." Lawrence's heart stood still for a moment, and then went on at double quick speed. So the confession he had prepared his mind to hear was coming at last, and his darling was about to be cleared from the slightest shadow of suspicion. "Well, what is it, mother?" "You see, dear child, poverty is peculiarly repellent to any one of my refined and sensitive nature. And not only repellent, it is also positively injurious. It creates faults, or rather I should say weaknesses, which otherwise would not exist, and which have never distinguished any of the motes before, and it prevents the full development of virtues which properly belong to my character." "Yes, yes, I hear." Lawrence was impatient, but his mother was not going to be hurried. "Therefore I feel it to be my duty to myself and to all around me to escape from a state which is so injurious to my higher nature. You see, it is the duty of us all to cultivate our higher natures. Dear St. Paul says something about working out our own salvation, and I am sure he means by this that we must avoid all things which are not profitable to us. In fact, he uses those exact words, if I remember rightly." "And poverty is not profitable to your salvation? Is that what you mean, mother?" "Yes, dear child. How quickly you comprehend things. If only your poor dear father had understood me as well as you do, what a much better and happier woman I might have been." Lawrence had his doubts as to the accuracy of the deduction, but he wisely refrained from putting them into words. "Therefore I felt for some time that it was my duty at all costs to escape from poverty. I was not doing myself or my higher instincts anything like justice, and it is so beautiful to do justice to one's highest and best self, whatever sacrifice it may involve. Even if it be Baxendale Hall itself that happens to be the burnt offering." Lady Alicia sighed. "But that sacrifice was wasted, you see, owing to your unfortunate wrong-headedness and obstinacy." "Then what is the second sacrifice involved in this moral regeneration?" "It is hardly a sacrifice, dear Lawrence, though I shall always believe that Baxendale Hall was burned by a miracle in order to give my higher nature a chance of fuller development. I remember once coming upon a beautiful little poem about something for which I pant, and fuller something else I want, which exactly expresses all that I feel." Lawrence could hardly control his impatience. "As I unfortunately spoiled sacrifice number one, for goodness' sake, tell me what sacrifice number two is, and be quick about it." "It is not a sacrifice, as I have told you, dear Lawrence. It is only a sweet, beautiful change and development. Dear Lord Watercress, with whom at Cannes I renewed my former friendship, has again asked me to be his wife, and I have accepted him." Lawrence was dumbfounded. He had never dreamt of his mother's marrying again. "I think it is so touching and beautiful," continued Lady Alicia, "that I should be given another chance of happiness, after having been so foolish as to refuse him for the sake of your father all those years ago. As dear Shakespeare says, there is a divinity which puts things straight again, however much we may make a mull of them ourselves." Then Lawrence found words. "I hope Lord Watercress will make you very happy, mother," he said gently. "I'm sure he will, dear child. He has 20,000 a year, and two most charming places. He says we must each go our own way, and neither be bothered with the other, as there is money enough for both. So different from your poor dear father, who was always wanting me to be with him, and never could be happy without me. Ah, dear Lord Watercress could have given him a lesson in unselfishness. We'll leave my father out of the conversation altogether, if you don't mind, mother, and devote our attention to his successor. You see, dear Lawrence, I am sure it is my duty to marry a rich man if I can, and it is very sweet of you to take it so nicely. You don't seem a bit angry, and I was so afraid you would be." "No, I am not angry. I've no right to be. And I want to tell you something else, just to show you what a lot of harm poverty was doing to my character, and how necessary it is for me to be rich, if I am to be as good as I should like to be, and as I ought to be, for it is everybody's duty to be good, don't you think?" "I suppose so, but it's a pretty hard job sometimes. Of course you will keep what I'm going to tell you quite a secret, won't you?" "Mother, is it necessary to ask me that?" "Well, then," said Lady Alicia, in a nervous, deprecating manner, totally unlike her usual calm serenity, "would you believe it of me, dear Lawrence, I so hated being poor that I made up my mind to set fire to Baxendale Hall on purpose to get the insurance money. I did indeed. Isn't it awful to think that poverty could bring a gentlewoman and a mote to such a strait as that?" And her ladyship began to cry. "Don't cry, mother dear, but tell me all about it." Lawrence was putting a tremendous restraint upon himself. "That is all, and it is bad enough, goodness knows. I see now how wicked of me it would have been. But at that time I wanted money so dreadfully that I didn't care what sin I committed to get it." "Then didn't you carry out your intention after all?" asked Lawrence, with a strange tight feeling around his heart. "No, no," sobbed Lady Alicia. "But that was no credit to me. It was when I was contemplating this wicked step that somebody forestalled me, goodness knows who, and actually did what I had intended to do. And then when I heard what people said and thought about the crime, I realized what a lucky woman I had been just to have escaped committing it. You see, I never knew how wrong it was till I heard other people say so." Lawrence fell on his knees at his mother's feet. "Mother, swear to me that you are speaking the truth, that you did not carry out your intention. Remember, even if you did, I would freely forgive you, and keep the secret with my life." "No, I didn't do it, Lawrence. Indeed I didn't. Though I don't see that I am really much better than if I had. It was not my fault that I didn't carry out my sinful intention. Oh, it is dreadful to think that I, a mote, could have sunk so low." Lawrence stretched out a trembling hand, and seized a Bible that was lying on his mother's work table. "Will you kiss this, and swear that it wasn't you who set fire to the Hall?" Lady Alicia kissed the book. "I swear that it was not I," she said solemnly, "though I feel my guilt is the same as if it were." Lawrence rose from his knees with his face as white as a sheet, for he knew that his mother was speaking the truth. She rose also. "I think I will go to bed now. Of course you will never mention to dear Lord Watercress what I have just told you?" "I swear I will never mention it to anybody as long as I live," replied Lawrence, kissing her. "Good night, mother. I hope you will be very happy." When Lady Alicia had left the room, he sank into a chair and buried his face in his hands. "So Nancy is the culprit after all," he groaned, "and I love her as I love my own soul." CHAPTER XXII. A Fuel of Fire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fuel of Fire by Ellen Thorneycroft Fowler. Chapter XXII. The Lanes again. In spite of all the ways you tried to stifle him with vain endeavour, love never for a moment died, but lives for ever. Baxendale, no doubt, ought to have rejoiced to find that his suspicions were incorrect so far as Lady Alicia was concerned. He felt this very strongly himself, and acknowledged in his heart that his modified satisfaction proved him to be a most undutiful son. Yet he had an excuse, so he had convinced himself, in the fact of the guilty persons being neither his mother nor Nancy, so that the exculpation of the one meant the implication of the other, wherefore the dutiful son gave way to the devout lover, which was human nature. None the less he repented him of having done his mother an injustice, although Lady Alicia's confession of her unlawful intention robbed this injustice of most of its grossness, and he tried in every way to make up to her for the imagination of his heart by an unwonted tenderness. Yet he could not conceal from himself that his cup of misery was well nigh overflowing. So long as a doubt existed in his mind as to whether of the twain was the culprit, he was able to give the benefit of the doubt to Nancy. He had been wretched enough, no doubt, yet the fact that the guilt of neither was assured seemed somehow to relieve both of the stigma. Now, however, he knew that his mother was as good as guilty, and he also was driven to the conclusion that her actual innocence fixed the crime on Nancy. Consequently, his heart was filled with grief and bitterness. Nancy a culprit! That was the fact, the horrible fact that stared him in the face. He hated himself for doubting her, yet as he turned the matter over and over again in his mind, his reason would not let him come to any other conclusion. It is hard for a man, when his reason apparently makes it impossible for him to believe the truths he learned as a child. It is harder still when his reason takes an opposite course, and makes it impossible for him to believe that the one who is dearer to him than life itself is worthy of his love. At this period of his life, Baxendale went through a time of storm and stress that left a lasting impress upon his character. He did his best to tear Nancy from his heart, but it was all in vain. It may be possible, or it is sometimes necessary, for a man to pluck out his offending eye, or cut off his offending right hand, but to exorcise from his heart the woman who has firmly ensconced herself therein is an operation which a certain type of man cannot perform and yet live, of which type was Lawrence Baxendale. The memories, bitter memories they were, of her lovely eyes and her bright wit, of her sweet temper and cheerful stoicism, of her tolerant good nature and tender sympathy, would come back and flood his soul. At such times his heart would rise superior to his reason, and he would swear to himself that one so sweet and noble could never be guilty, even for one she loved, of conduct so dishonourable. Then would come the reaction of common sense, and the facts which all pointed her out as the doer of the deed became unto him convincing evidence. Yet throughout all this turmoil of doubt and despair he loved her still. Nay, he loved her better than ever. He seemed possessed by an overmastering passion which he strove in vain to control. Then arose a struggle in his heart between his love and his pride. Pride demanded the sacrifice of Nancy on the altar of stainless ancestry and outraged family propriety. Love putting in a pitiful little plea for mercy, which he felt had no justification whatsoever. That Mercy would tend to his own personal satisfaction and comfort was to Baxendale a powerful argument in favour of severity. He would not have been the fit descendant of men who had died in defending the property of the Church in the time of Henry VIII, and in supporting the cause of the King in the time of Oliver Cromwell, if this had not been so. Thus the struggle went on, a struggle which was none the less severe because silent, and which told on Baxendale more than he would have cared to own. He shunned society more than ever. He became irritable and moody. He carried out all the routine work of the estate with exemplary care, but he had plenty of time on his hands. As he abjured any companionship, he devoted his spare time to wandering about and thinking of Nancy and holding the balance between pride and his love. But he never went into the lanes where he and Nancy used to walk in the golden days of old. That, he felt, was more than he could bear. Matters also were going on very hardly with Nancy. She was one of those women who are like thoroughbred horses. She would go on until she dropped. But it was borne in upon her that the time of dropping was near at hand. Although she likewise had hitherto studiously avoided the lanes, one afternoon when she was feeling specially low, a curious idea came to her that she would go to the stile where Lawrence had first kissed her, and there bid farewell to her brief spell of perfect bliss. By some subtle action of that force which men in their ignorance call chance, though it may be the Providence which shapes our ends, Lawrence Baxendale became possessed of a similar notion on that same afternoon. He had lately been finding the struggle to forget Nancy a little too much for him. Pride, though making a gallant fight of it, was playing a losing game. It only wanted a little more. At a touch he was, although he knew it not, prepared to yield. So it came to pass that he found himself, almost to his own surprise, wandering down the winding lanes where he and Nancy had passed such happy hours. The sweet memories of those days of bliss came back to him, and with them a passionate desire to see that dear face again. Ah, how sad it was when he saw it! To kiss again a look of happiness into those blue eyes, to bring back the old brightness, the old mirth. What mattered those dead and gone ancestors of his? What mattered his own pride of race compared with Nancy? Had not his mother meditated the very deed for which he condemned the girl? It was for no mercenary motives. He knew that she had done the deed in a moment of thoughtlessness. She had done it for love. For love! Yes, her love for him was so great that she had dared even a crime for his sake. He looked into his own heart and asked himself, who was he to pass judgment upon her? He had never committed a crime, it is true, yet did he not confess himself every Sunday a miserable sinner, and with truth? And should he, a sinner like the other Galileans, condemn her for a mad deed done for love? As he thought on these things, he looked up, and behold, there was Nancy herself at the stile. She did not see him, but at the sight of her the last vestige of pride disappeared. He was filled with a passionate love, but with his love there came a new feeling, humility. While not condoning Nancy's fault, he condemned himself for his Pharisaism, for how did he differ from him who thanked God that he was not as this publican? Dare he approach her? Dare he speak to her? How would she receive him? These thoughts crowded thickly upon his brain. He hesitated for a moment, and then walked on. "My darling," he said softly. Nancy looked up with a startled cry. You," she cried. "Why do you come here to torment me? You have destroyed my happiness and spoiled my life. Can you not leave me to die in peace?" Lawrence was stricken with remorse at her words, still more at the sight of her face. "Nancy," he whispered gently, "can you ever forgive me? I have come to tell you that I am sorry. I was mad when I said that we must part. I cannot live without you. Sweetheart, I love you. I love you." Nancy still looked at him with dilated eyes. She seemed not to have heard a word he said. "So you have come to gloat upon the ruin you have wrought, to see what a wreck a woman can become who has been fool enough to love a man, truly a kind thought, a manly action." "How can you speak so bitterly, my own love? I am here to own my fault and to beg your forgiveness. Can you not understand that I adore you, that I cannot live without you?" Nancy shook her head sadly. "You should have thought of that before. It is your own doing. You said that we must see each other no more. You threw me aside without a thought. If you now see that it was all a mistake, you have only yourself to blame." Baxendale found this reception a rude shock. He had looked at the matter from his own point of view alone, and had supposed, now that he was ready to overlook Nancy's crime, he had only to propose a renewal of their own relations to be received with open arms. He was not prepared to find any reluctance on the girl's part to a renewal of their lease of love. He had been so consumed by his conviction of Nancy's guilt that he had taken for granted that she was aware that he knew. It had never occurred to him to look at the matter from her side, or to imagine that he had failed in any way in what was due from him to her, so that her attitude came upon him with a shock of surprise. He was in a difficult position. He was anxious, nay, eager to take her again to himself. He had a passionate desire to clasp her in his arms, and swear that nothing in heaven or earth should separate them again. But he could hardly say to her, "My dear, I know you are a criminal, but I am prepared to overlook the fact." And unless he said something of the kind, it would be hard for him to explain his past conduct should she demand an explanation. He had expected her to jump into his arms at the first hint of a relenting from his stoical attitude. It was perhaps a useful lesson for him to find that pride was not a monopoly of the Baxendale family. So many families have an idea that pride and sensitiveness are peculiar to themselves, as white cattle to Chartley and black rabbits to Hawkstone. "I know I have only myself to blame," he said at last, humbly. "But you would be merciful and forgiving if you knew the state of misery I have been in for the last 6 months. It has been all your own doing. I know it, but that makes it the worse. Hell is not the less hell because a man has prepared it for himself," said Baxendale with some bitterness. "And do you suppose I have not been miserable, too? In your pity for yourself, have you never had a thought to waste on me?" cried Nancy. "It is the old story. A man plays with a woman's heart as he plays with a football. It is a good game and requires some skill. And when the heart is broken and he cannot play with it any more, he just gets a new ball and goes on with the game. One ball is as good as another for him. Naturally, being a man, it is the game itself he cares for, not the necessary implements." "Heaven knows you are doing me an injustice," cried Baxendale passionately. "I have loved you all through. When I have seemed most cold and most heartless, I have adored you most. You had a strange way of showing it. I hoped and thought you would forget me when you were in fresh scenes and saw new faces. No one knows how cut to the heart I was when I saw your face on your return and recognized how much you had suffered." "Why did you not tell me so?" asked Nancy. "Why did I not?" replied her lover. "I cannot tell you. You must not ask me. But believe me, my darling, that I love you more than life itself. I am filled with remorse for all the suffering I have caused you, and if you will only forgive me, I will have but one object for the future, your happiness." Nancy did not speak, so Lawrence went on. "I cannot offer you a luxurious home such as you are accustomed to, but I can at least offer you reasonable comforts. My mother, you may have heard, is about to marry again. For the future I shall not have her to support, nor," here Lawrence winced, "have to pay the premiums on the insurance. I do not wish there to be any mistake, so I will say at once that I cannot. It is not I will not, but I cannot take the insurance money. But my income, though small, will enable me to maintain you without that." Baxendale paused after this lengthy and somewhat unlover-like speech. On the whole, he might have done worse. During the recitation of these prosaic details, Nancy had time to recover herself, and the subtle influence of the man began to make itself felt. When Lawrence paused, Nancy said, "You don't suppose I care a straw about your money? or your comforts, or your luxuries, do you?" Lawrence was quick to perceive a change in her tone. "Nancy, darling," he whispered, "don't you know where we are? Don't you remember the dear old style, and the lovely times we used to anticipate? It cannot be all over. You will forgive me, won't you? You love me, I know you love me, and we could be so happy together." As he spoke, his arm stole gently round her waist. Nancy did not withdraw herself, though she stiffened slightly. "Sweetheart," he went on, and his voice shook in its passionate entreaty, "you do not know how much I love you. I adore you. I love your sweet eyes. I love your dear face. Look up, my beloved. Surely the winter is over and the summer is at hand. You love me, my darling. Say that you love me and will forgive me. You said that it was better that we should see each other no more. If I did, I lied. You preferred your pride to me. If I did, I was a fool. But love, glorious love, has conquered pride, and you have conquered me." They had walked a short distance from the stile. Now, by mutual consent, they turned and walked back in silence. When they reached it, Lawrence again whispered, "Nancy, my own darling, cannot you love me just a little?" And Nancy looked up with swimming eyes. She did not speak, but her look was enough for Lawrence. Their lips met in a long kiss, and the estrangement was at an end. And they were happy, supremely happy, ridiculously happy. For the time, Lawrence forgot his suspicions. Indeed, he determined to blot them out of his remembrance. As for Nancy, the bloom already began to come back into her pale cheeks, and her blue eyes were bright with her deep love. "Lawrence, dear," she said, "you have made me very miserable in the past, but I am almost glad of it, because now it throws up the new happiness like something done in bas relief, or looked at through a stereoscope. Don't you know? And you forgive me, my own?" "I forgive you, but on one condition, that you never refer to all this horridness again. Let it be as if it had never been. We won't remember the miserable time. We will be happy in the future. When Nora and I were little, and the games went wrong, and we quarreled over them, we used to say, 'Let's pretend it didn't happen,' and then we began the game all over again in peace. It was such a good plan, because it didn't leave any sore places. And now I say again, let's pretend it didn't happen, and we'll begin the game all over again, and leave no sore places." And so they went on, hand in hand, wrapped up in their present bliss. And in spite of all her cleverness, it never once entered Nancy's head that her lover indeed suspected her, since his present behaviour seemed so satisfactorily to prove the contrary. So little do men and women, even when they are in love with each other, read each other's inmost thoughts. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Fuel of Fire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fuel of Fire by Ellen Thorneycroft Fowler. Chapter 23. The Professor's Visit. Love evermore is fresh and young, so may it please your Royal Highness to banish from your mother tongue such words as finis. There was great delight all through Tetley and the neighbourhood thereof, when the engagement of Mr. Baxendale to Miss Burton was announced. An engagement which one has seen coming on is always so much more flattering to one's self-esteem, and therefore more popular in proportion, than an engagement which suddenly jumps out upon one and takes one completely by surprise. The former shows us how wise and foreseeing all we onlookers have been, while the latter proves, or rather tries to prove, that we can see only what is under our own noses, and no further through a stone wall than other people, which deduction is, of course, absurd. Although it might be a fine alliance socially for Nancy, it was by no means a brilliant match from a pecuniary point of view, and to this fact Mr. Burton could not close his paternal eyes. But now that Lady Alicia was provided for, Lawrence could justly afford to keep a wife, and moreover, Nancy's mind was made up to marry him or die, and she had shown such unmistakable signs of actually fulfilling the latter alternative, if the former were denied her, that her father decided in his own mind that as, according to Solomon, a living married daughter was better than a dead single one, or words to that effect, he would not withhold his consent to Nancy's becoming the wife of Lawrence Baxendale. As for the two lovers themselves, words could not describe their happiness. It is true that there is no heart sickness harder to bear than that of hope long deferred. But on the other hand, there is no tree of life whereof the fruit is sweeter than that of the long deferred desire at last fulfilled. And now Lawrence and Nancy were enjoying this fruit to the fullest extent of their by no means limited powers. Compensation is one of the great laws of life, and those people whose hearts' desires have been given to them at the mere request of their lips have no idea of the ecstasy of bliss vouchsafed to those whose happiness arrives late, after having tarried long upon the way. In the sunshine of her restored happiness, Nancy soon began to grow strong and well again, while Lawrence resolutely put away from him all remembrance of the crime which had once well nigh wrecked his life, and decided that as he had forgiven so much, he would forget. Lady Alicia was married very quietly to her old lover in London on the 12th of June. Nancy's wedding was fixed to take place at Tetley Church on the 10th of September, and in the interval it happened that Professor Gottfried, a most distinguished scientist with whom the Arbuthnot's had made friends on their honeymoon, came to stay at the vicarage for a few days. The professor was not one of those clever people whose chins are always in the air. He was one of those men of genius who know that nothing is beneath the notice of man, since nothing is beneath the notice of God. So he was immensely interested in everything that was going on around him, and having learned much, was always longing to learn more. While he was staying at Tetley, he heard the story of the burning of Baxendale Hall, and the mystery connected with it, and his attention was immediately aroused thereby. Over and over again he made Michael and Nora describe to him every detail of the incident, with all the evidence that told so strongly against Lawrence, until they grew weary of the recital. And then Nora suggested that they should take him up to the ruins of the Hall, so that he might study the question more minutely upon the very scene of the tragedy. So it came to pass one glorious afternoon in August that the Arbuthnot's, Professor Gottfried, Lawrence, Nancy, and Nancy's two small brothers, strolled up to examine all that was left of Baxendale Hall. It was a lovely day, just such another day as that which had preceded the catastrophe exactly a year ago, only there was no gale this August, as there had been last. One of those perfect summer afternoons when nature seems to be at a standstill, simply because there is nothing better to do than she has already done. She is at her wits' end how to find another treat for her already spoiled children. They walked slowly through the lanes, those lanes which were as holy ground to at least two of the party, who considered the others guilty of sacrilege in daring to walk there at all, until they reached the park, and then across the velvet grass to the ruins, which stood gaunt and grim and blackened, the one inharmonious touch in the idyllic picture of English summer time. Then Lawrence took the professor all over his devastated home, pointing out as fully as he could where the fire broke out and how it travelled. The man of science followed him with absorbing interest. "It is most strange, he kept saying. "I cannot at all find it out." "It never will be found out now, I expect," replied Lawrence, adding under his breath, "and hope." But Professor Gottfried had no such wish. It was his business to solve problems and to make discoveries, and he did not like to be beaten. "It must have been set on fire from the inside," he continued. "There is no doubt of that. To set a house on fire from the outside, and to be in on the upper story, is a most impossible and not to be believed in thing. Yet the ground floor by the fire quite untouched has been. But why did you not this floor roof over again before everything was spoiled?" "Because I couldn't afford to do so," said Lawrence simply. "Ach! But it is a bother not things to be able to afford." "It is, there's no doubt of that," and the master Baxendale laughed somewhat bitterly. And there was no one in the house living, you tell me, at the time. Even the caretakers had for a short holiday gone away. Was that not so?" "Yes." "And they had all keys into your hands before going given?" "So did Arbuthnot tell me." "That is so." Lawrence hated this endeavour to discover a secret, which his chief desire now was to keep inviolate. He had forgiven Nancy with all his heart, but he was by no means sure that the world, if it found out her guilt, would be equally ready to forgive her, and he was quite certain that he did not wish the world ever to have the chance. So he tried to divert the professor's attention. "If you will come with me across the lawn to that clump of beech trees on the other side, I will give you a glimpse into 5 counties," he said. But it required a stronger man than Baxendale to divert the professorial mind, when once it had set itself to the solution of a particular problem. "I do not want to see 5 counties, no, nor 50 counties. I do want the mystery of this house to solve." "It's no good trying to do that, Professor. We've all tried, and have given it up as a bad job, and you'll be compelled to do the same." "Ach, what nonsense you young men do talk, and how idle you are. A bad job, indeed. Who ever heard of in mathematics a bad job? To every question there is an answer if only one can find it, and I mean this one to find out before I go." "It's no good, Professor. You'd better take my advice and give it up." But the professor was not to be balked. He pottered about the ruins for another hour, with Lawrence at his heels, and then was so hot and tired that he was obliged to join the group sitting under the beech trees, and partake of a tea which Mrs. Candy had carried up from her cottage in a basket. "What a perfect afternoon it is!" exclaimed Nora, with a sigh of absolute contentment, laying her hand upon her husband's, and looking at her sister, from whose face joy was already beginning to play the part of india rubber and erase sorrow's handwriting. "Nancy, dear, do you ever wonder what you have done to deserve such happiness?" Nancy shook her head. "No, but I sometimes wonder what Lawrence has." "Isn't it funny that food always tastes so much nicer out of doors than it does indoors?" remarked that young lady, when the meal was well under way. "I believe that even boiled mutton or rice pudding would seem regular delicacies in the open air." "Food eaten out of doors is nice even to read about in books," said Nora. Her sister agreed. "Yes, isn't it? Now when you read about Robin Hood and people of that sort, taking venison pasties and stoups of claret in the merry greenwood, spelled with IE instead of Y, it sounds the most delicious fare. Yet I'm certain that claret handed round in stoups, whatever a stoup may be, would taste awfully sour in a modern dining room. And as for venison—" "Well, what's wrong with venison?" asked Lawrence, with a smile, as Nancy paused. He was already unconsciously acquiring the manner peculiar to those men who are blessed with brilliant wives. He led up to her best stories, played up to her smartest repartees, and, when she was in full swing, his lips moved slightly, as do the lips of prompters in amateur theatricals. "Oh, venison is nothing but mutton with its head turned, and it's as troublesome as are all the people whose heads have been turned. You never can catch it at the right moment, like a pear or an eclipse, don't you know. It has either not been kept long enough, when it is mutton and too tough to eat, or else it has been kept too long, in which case either it or you has to leave the house at once in favour of the other. And then to return to your mutton is dangerous to life from a sanitary point of view." While Nancy was rattling on in her old airy, inconsequent fashion, with nobody but Lawrence paying much attention to what she said, Professor Gottfried was showing the little boys some grass and flowers through a powerful magnifying glass which he happened to have in his pocket. Suddenly Arthur raised the glass and regarded the surrounding landscape through it. "I say, Ambie," he cried, "do come here and see how funny all the trees and everything look through this." Ambrose flew to his brother's side and gazed through the glass with one blue eye, puckering up the other until every muscle on that side of his small face was taut. "It is awfully queer," he exclaimed. "Everything looks so big and wobbly, doesn't it? As if the world was full of water. Let's pretend we're at the bottom of the sea, and the trees are made of seaweed." "Let me look," said Nancy, whose finger was not long out of any pie. She could not bear to be outside of things. After she had gazed her fill, which was a very short one, Lawrence took the glass from her, more for the pleasure of touching her fingers, it must be admitted, than from any desire to behold the phenomenon which it presented, and idly raised it to his eyes. "It makes me feel like a child again," he remarked after a moment. "There used to be a flaw in the nursery window here which magnified things when you looked through it, and, as Ambrose said, made everything wobbly and watery. I likewise remember pretending the world was the bottom of the sea in those days when I looked through that particular pane in the old nursery window. Eh? What is that? What is that?" cried the Professor, with suddenly awakened interest. "I was only saying that looking through your glass at this view reminded me of looking through my old nursery window, as there was a flaw in one of the panes there that magnified everything," replied Lawrence, languidly. The Professor's almost childish interest in trifles and curiosity regarding the same bored him considerably. Professor Gottfried started to his feet and clapped his hands in an ecstasy of enthusiasm, thereby upsetting his tea and bread and butter in one fell crash. "I have it! I have it!" he cried. "The mystery of the fire at last is cleared. The never to be solved problem is solved. The bad job is not to be given up any more, but is a very good job after all." "What on earth do you mean, Professor?" asked the vicar in amazement, while the others looked on, imagining that too much learning had made the little German mad. "I mean that to me it has been given the great mystery of this house to solve. I mean that I do know how Baxendale Hall was by accident burned. That is what I do mean," and the Professor fairly skipped with excitement. Lawrence's face turned as white as a sheet. "For heaven's sake, tell us what you are driving at," he said between his teeth. "Listen, pay attention, and I will tell you all," cried the Professor. "See, the thing is quite simple. But tell me first, was the nursery to the library at all near?" "It was next to it," replied Lawrence, "and on the same floor." "And for what was it, after the hall was shut up, used?" "As a sort of overflow meeting for the library," Lawrence answered. "Some books and papers for which there wasn't room in the library were stored there." He kept himself well in hand, but he could not quite hide the trembling of the fingers that twirled his moustache in a vain show of indifference. "Then it is all as child's play simple," fairly shouted Professor Gottfried. "When the sun did shine upon the able to magnify flaw in the window, the flaw did become a fire glass. And so the great sun himself did thus to the books and papers in the room set fire. See here." And while they stood breathless with surprise at the Professor's discovery, he held his magnifying glass where the hot August sunlight could fall upon it, and quickly burned a large hole in Mrs. Candy's best tablecloth. Nancy was the first to find words. "Then you believe it was the sun that set fire to Baxendale Hall?" And if so, the old prophecy was actually fulfilled, for the sun is thrice as great as king or state, and 1,000 times stronger and higher. I make no doubt, dear young lady, that it was none other than the great sun himself that did the crime commit. Who else could have the library entered without first opening the door and walking up the stairs? The fire would in the afternoon begin, when the sun at the southwest windows was shining in, and for hours it would smolder, and then it would into a flame burst, and the strong wind would fan it, and the books and the papers would like so much tinder burn. Nancy's face was pale with excitement, and her eyes were dim with joyful tears. "Yes, yes, I'm sure you are right, and oh, I'm so glad that the secret has been found out at last." Suddenly the Professor's jaw fell. "But stop! I do not see. Why did the sun that particular afternoon to Baxendale Hall set fire, when for 100 years or more he had been on that very window shining every day?" "I know," cried Nancy. "The great tree at the back of the hall was blown down by the gale the day before, so that the sun shone for the first time on the nursery window that particular afternoon." Professor Gottfried positively flung his arms round Nancy in his exuberance. "That is it! That is it, clever, clever girl! That does everything most clearly explain. The tree which had always that window shaded did fall. The sun on the flaw in the glass did shine. The flaw in the window did as the sun glass act, and did to the books and papers on which the sunlight fell, set fire. The books and papers did so quickly burn that the fire to the house did itself extend. The strong wind did fan the flames so fast that they like wildfire did travel. And so in one day and night Baxendale Hall was down burned." Then no one entered the hall that afternoon. It was Lawrence that spoke, but the voice was not his own. No one, no one, if they had, the fire discovered, would have been. When you, as you told me in the morning of that day, were here, the sun had not on the windows shone, and the fire had not begun. It was when the sun on the west front of the house was shining that the flaw in the pane of glass to the hall did set fire, and then no one even into the house again did come. "And this explains why the fire started from the upper story," continued Lawrence, in the same unnatural voice. "It does all things connected with this matter explain," replied the professor. "It does explain how the fire from inside and upstairs did begin, and how it did begin though all the doors were locked, for the sun can without any keys enter." Professor Gottfried's words brought full conviction to the minds of all his hearers, and the sudden enormous relief was almost more than Lawrence could bear. So he turned away in silence, and went down into the beech wood that fringed the lawns of his old home, and there struggled to regain that self control over his feelings of which the unexpected joy produced by the professor's discovery had almost robbed him. After a few minutes Nancy left the group that was so busily engaged in discussing Professor Gottfried's solution of the Baxendale mystery, finding fresh proofs of its truth in every new aspect and consideration, and followed her lover into the wood. "Darling," she said, laying a caressing hand upon his arm, which was still trembling, "I am so glad." Lawrence could not speak, but he raised the little hand to his lips and covered it with kisses. So it came to pass that the mystery of Baxendale Hall was solved at last by the ingenuity of Professor Gottfried. All the false suspicions and the heart burnings which they had caused were over for ever, and everybody was heartily ashamed of having suspected everybody else. The professor's discovery made a considerable sensation, both socially and scientifically, and for a time people were almost as much afraid of magnifying glasses as they were of gunpowder and dynamite. The insurance company was so thoroughly satisfied with the professor's explanation of the otherwise inexplicable mystery that it again expressed its willingness to pay to Mr. Baxendale the sum to which he was entitled, and this time he had no option and no desire but to avail himself of his rights. And after much consideration and discussion, he and Nancy decided that they would invest £70,000 and live upon the income thereof, settling the capital upon the estate, and that they would spend the other £30,000 in building a new house upon the old foundations, a house not too large for their present means, and yet capable of being added to, should further prosperity shine in the future upon the Baxendale family. One sunny afternoon, about a fortnight before their marriage, Lawrence and Nancy were sitting together upon the old stile, which had proved such an important stage property in the drama of their lives, and they were going over, for the 250th time, the story of the burning of Baxendale. They had just gone over, for the 2050th time, the story of their love for each other, and the peculiar unsmoothness of its course. So they turned their attention to the fire as a slight diversion before beginning the 2051st recital of the more interesting narrative. "You were awfully silly to mind all the nonsense that stupid people talked about your having done it yourself," remarked Nancy in conclusion. "I daresay I was. I often am awfully silly, you know. It is a way I have. But I did mind it confoundedly, nevertheless." "Foolish boy. As if anybody who had ever had so much as a bird's eye view of you could seriously suspect you of doing anything that Sir Richard Lovelace and the Chevalier Bayard hadn't done every day of their lives." "But they did suspect me, my sweetheart, and those who have enjoyed considerably more than a bird's eye view of me, and example speaks louder than precept, you know." "But they didn't really suspect you. They only pretended they did, just for the fun of the thing, because it's always so interesting to suspect people of doing what you know they couldn't possibly have done. Half the fun of being good is that it gives such flavour and point to your few lapses, while the lapses of habitually faulty people entirely lack this charm." Lawrence stroked Nancy's cheek with his forefinger. "What shockingly immoral teaching!" "Well, it's quite true. Think how glorious it is when mother upsets her tea, or father his claret, on the tablecloth. Yet if I or the boys do such a thing, there is no real joy in it at all. And that is why people pretended that they thought you had set fire to the Hall. If you'd been less sans peur and sans reproche, there'd have been no point in even suggesting such a thing." "My darling," said Lawrence, after a pause, still fondling the cheek which he had made so pale, "did you ever think I had done it?" Nancy's blue eyes grew round with amazement. "I? Good gracious, no. I'm not such a goose as all that. Though I was so foolish as to fall in love with you, I have still sense enough left not to suspect you of any redeeming fallibility, and honesty enough not to pretend that I do. Let my folly stand out in its true colours. Having discovered a man who is absolutely perfect, I have been idiotic enough to promise to marry him, although he never attempted to conceal any of his virtues, nor assumed any faults which he was not so fortunate as actually to possess. My dearest, I've something horrible to confess to you. I wonder if you can ever forgive me?" "Of course I can. I'm silly enough for anything where you are concerned. What is it? Fire away." Lawrence stooped down and hid his face in Nancy's lap. "I know I was a brute, a devil. You can't be more disgusted with me than I am with myself, and if you refuse to marry me after you hear what I am going to say, I cannot blame you. My darling, I actually believed all the time that it was you who had set fire to the Hall. More shame to me. Now can you ever bring yourself to forgive me?" There was a pause. Then Nancy said slowly, "You believed that it was me all the time?" Lawrence groaned. "Yes. Curse my blind folly. When did you find out that it wasn't me, after all?" "When old Gottfried found out how it really had been done." "Not till then?" "No, not till then." "And you asked me to marry you, believing that I was the guilty person?" "I couldn't help it. I loved you so, that I meant to marry you, whatever you had done. Guilty or not guilty, you were the only woman in the world for me. But I shall never forgive myself for thinking you guilty, and I feel I cannot ask you to forgive me. Oh, my darling, what a brute I have been to you, and although I was so vile as to suspect you, my own innocent angel, you were believing in me all the time. My sweetheart, I am not fit to touch the hem of your garment." And poor Lawrence groaned once more in the anguish of his soul. But Nancy did not groan. She laid her hand on her lover's head, while her eyes shone like stars. "My dear, I've nothing to forgive. You have made me prouder than I ever was in my life before. I don't blame you for suspecting me, because I'd once suggested that you should burn the Hall yourself, if you remember, though I only said it in fun. And then I'd got the keys, so there was nothing in that. But what makes me so proud and happy is that your love for me was great enough to overcome all obstacles, even your suspicion that I had done the thing which you abhorred. Oh, my darling, I know now how much you love me. God grant that I may prove myself worthy of such love." And Nancy took the bowed head into her arms and covered it with passionate kisses. A new house stands now on the site of old Baxendale Hall, a picturesque red brick house designed after the fashion of the Elizabethans, but with every Victorian comfort and convenience. And it smiles across the valley at Silverhampton Church on the opposite hill, as its three predecessors smiled before it. But now there is no shadow on its smile, no shadow of a curse as yet unfulfilled. And to those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, the new house and the old church bring the same message, the message that good is stronger than evil, and therefore is bound to conquer in the end, be the warfare never so long, and the battle never so bitter. To all who possess their souls in patience, it is given to see the morning joy, which is the sure successor of the night of weeping, to behold the marvelous light, which must finally disperse all clouds and darkness, either here and now, where there fall other shadows, and where fresh clouds return after the rain, or else in that fairer country where there is no need of the sun to lighten it, and where the winter is over and past for evermore. So the story of the Baxendales ends well, as all stories must inevitably end, if we will only wait long enough. But the end is not always yet, and we are in such a hurry. Since good is stronger than evil, and truth than falsehood, and blessing than cursing, no story can possibly end badly. While it is going on badly, we know that this is not the end, just as we know that the end of anything is only the beginning of something better, and always must be, as long as God's in his heaven, and all's right with the world. Once more the Baxendales can dwell under their own roof tree, until their own lands in peace, unhampered by the conviction that again their home will be destroyed by fire, and their house left unto them desolate. That age-long fear is over and past. The old curse has exhausted itself, and the ancient prophecy has been fulfilled to the letter. For first by the king, and then by the state, and thirdly by that which is thrice as great as these, and 1,000-fold stronger and higher, has Baxendale Hall been made fuel of fire. The end. End of Section 23. End of Fuel of Fire by Ellen Thorneycroft Fowler.